Okay, so this is the second part in the series that I'm doing on My Little Pony and the wider influence it's had in my life, with this part mainly focusing on fan fiction. Now, in terms of how it kind of ties into the wider history I've had with My Little Pony, with both the show, the community, the fandom, there is no direct chronology in terms of how fan fiction has affected me and my reading of it. Again, much like with the show and the fandom itself, as I explained in the last video, I kind of got obsessed with it, fell out with it, got obsessed with it, fell out with it, but it has always came back in that cycle. It's a kind of consistency, it's a constant. So a lot of this overlaps with the other periods, really with every period, but it is the next step. After this, I said, I first found the show, I discovered it, I then became obsessed with YouTube videos on it, kind of secondary media, whether it be fan animations, songs, news reports, documentaries, literally anything. Fan fiction was the next step, and as I also said in my last video, I was obsessed with creepypastas, which were really blowing up in the early 2010s. I would really say that was the kind of height and the peak of the genre. And with this also being the peak of the MLP fandom, as you can imagine, there was a lot of crossover over there. So again, I was completely obsessed with creepypastas at the time. This is about 2013. There was dozens of channels making them, they were spitting out. There was a ridiculous amount coming out. And luckily the well hadn't been ran completely dry as it has been today. So a lot of them were actually quite decent. They were actually of quite a decent quality. You'd of course get kind of bad ones, mediocre ones, but initially coming across it, initially discovering it, having listened to none of them before, again, there was a really great wealth of good creepypastas out there. So kind of discovering creepypastas, and then soon after, probably just a few months afterwards, discovering My Little Pony. You can imagine how that tied in, especially with the first, or I believe it is the first. If it's not the first, it's certainly the first one that blew up big, and one of the first My Little Pony fan fictions ever, being a creepypasta Cupcakes. There was quite a few My Little Pony creepypastas online, and this is how I initially came into contact with fan fiction. I don't believe I actually listened to Cupcakes, but I can remember The Cough, I can remember a few other generic ones, but that was really the gateway that got me into it. And soon after that I was listening to, again like I had been before, just every kind of My Little Pony fan fiction there was, whether it be Human and Equestria, adventure, romance, comedy, slice of life, dark. Regardless of whatever it was, I was listening to it, whether it be a 20-minute short story or a series that ran on for 20 hours with kind of several chapters. And when I eventually did find the kind of genre that I stuck to, and I eventually migrated over to fan fiction and actually started reading stories and not just listening to them, probably the two biggest genres, and again there's a lot of overlap here that I really get into, was Human and Equestria stories and romance, whether it be romance between ponies, but again romance in terms of a human and Equestria having a romantic relationship with a pony. And as you can imagine, as the kind of meme is, or was for Human and Equestria stories, they're all kind of self-inserts. The reason that I became so obsessed with Human and Equestria stories, and particularly the romantic side of them, was that I did essentially for a long while live vicariously through these stories. This is a time when I was in high school. I didn't really have any friends to speak of, at least no close ones. It was kind of, well, as you can imagine, a kind of a loner, the weird kid. I spent most of my time by myself, both in school and after school, both during the school season and at the summer holidays. So with a kind of lack of a social life and a decent imagination, I became, again, possibly even more so than I was initially, obsessed with My Little Pony fanfictions. Just in terms of trolling through fanfiction, the main site, listening to literally, at the time at least, every single Human Equestria story that was on YouTube. Kind of really messing with the algorithm of fanfiction, looking up different stories with different characters, following different fanfictions, looking at different groups, looking at different genres, just anything, any kind of Human Equestria My Little Pony fanfiction, particularly romantic, I was on it. And to my credit, I read stories that were literally hundreds of thousands of words long. I can remember, and this is actually, well, it technically is a Human Equestria story, but the human transforms into a griffin. But I can remember Griffin the Griffin being really one that had a massive impact on me, which ran for 600,000 words. And again, I read the whole thing. I read fan fictions that were as long as War and Peace, and I read fan fictions that, if they were printed on a book, would have been 10 pages. Again, it was a complete obsession. As I said, I was living vicariously through them. I was imagining myself as certain characters. I was imagining myself in their place, certain scenarios. I get wrapped up in certain worlds in particular. I can remember Bonbon's Acceptance being another big one, which is a kind of Human Equestria polyamorous story between, well, the Human Equestria, Lyra and Bonbon, and just the kind of world building, the characterisation, the fact that it really felt alive. Again, I mean, really, it felt like one-off, if not the most lived-in worlds I've read in any kind of fiction, not just My Little Pony fan fiction. And I think that is because it was such a simple topic. There wasn't any kind of, it wasn't overly dramatic. It wasn't an adventure or a dark. It was very kind of slice of life, interpersonal issues. But the prose was so great, the characterisation was so great, everything was kind of so excellent that, again, it just felt genuinely lived in. I felt like it was very vivid. I grew attached to a lot of the characters in it, and I still feel quite attached to them. And this was really one of the main kind of fan fiction worlds that, again, I really kind of wove myself into. I remember another one was the Geoverse, which, and this isn't why I was interested in it, but coincidentally is written by a Scottish guy, a Glaswegian guy. And I believe this literally is just a self-insert, because the human that gets transported to Equestria also lives in Glasgow. He talks about the street he lives in. He talked about, as funny as it sounds, kind of like certain streets in the town, like he was walking down Jamaica Street, I believe it was, and then suddenly found himself there. But again, there was all sorts of scientists. I can remember it pretty vividly, but not enough to describe it, if that makes sense. But I really became attached to that world, and looking back on it, at least from what I remember, the writing, the prose was quite poor, but there was a certain kind of charm to it, a certain kind of innocence to it almost. It felt like the person that was writing it was really quite young, but it was consistent. It was a whole series of stories. I think there was about half a dozen main stories, possibly more, and then dozens of little like side stories, little anecdotes, kind of like shorts. And it was this whole little world they made with the character going to Equestria, falling in love with Twilight Sparkle, I didn't really like the conclusion of it when other humans came to Equestria, but in terms of the main kind of plot of the story, the vast majority of it, again, it just seemed really innocent. There was a certain loveliness to it. I would say other ones, I believe it was the Sunflower Project, was one of the first ones I also got obsessed with, which is a kind of a human goes to Equestria. That the kind of idea is that the Earth is dying, and she's a scientist that's been transported there by technology, and she's kind of surveying the world. But again, just there's so many I could mention. I can remember one about Applejack and a human, which I've tried several times to find because I've got a lot of nostalgia around that. Again, much like the Geoverse fiction, there was a certain kind of innocence to it almost, and that despite the fact that both both stories could get quite mature, it just maybe it's because I was so young, but I feel like there's a certain innocence to it again. Just the kind of romance between him and Applejack. There was Close Bonds, of course, which I did actually, again, I remember the name of it, but I did find quite recently, just a few months ago, and listened to, and I actually ended up not listening to it all the way. It was a lot worse than I remember, but again, I was a good deal younger at this point. Again, I really feel like I'm rambling again, but it's just I'm getting kind of wistful. I can barely even speak, but I'm just, again, there's so many floating through my mind, so many examples, and again, it is really it is one of, if not possibly, the most nostalgic kind of memories or experiences of my childhood that I have. Listening to these stories, reading these stories, living vicariously through them, getting wrapped up in the worlds. I remember, and I'm going to talk about Lyra in another video, but Lyra's being the main kind of character that I really got attached to. Also Twilight, Roseluck for a very short time. Again, the romances that I read, you get different kind of habits, you get different kind of tastes, but sometimes I did read darker stuff. I read more kind of adventure and dramatic stuff, but honestly the vast majority of what I read was slice of life, next to romance and human in terms of tags. Slice of life was the main tag that I used, another one being comedy, because again, maybe I was just looking for an escape, something that I could live vicariously through that was kind of simple, sweet. I didn't really, again, just something sweet, something nice, something another world. But I really like those simple, again, really slice of life, really kind of, it's not dramatic, it's not some big adventure, it's just a simple little romance, a little bit of comedy in there. Something that really feels kind of personal and from the heart. Although, speaking of which, I do remember, I believe it was a Castaway, which is a fan fiction where a human gets kind of transported to this island, not in Equestria, so it's not human in Equestria, but again, I will explain. And the kind of idea of this island is that all sorts of strange creatures and things are transported to it. So Twilight's transported there, the humans transported there, there's all sorts of kind of dinosaur creatures. They eventually run across a Starbucks in the middle of a desert, but there's kind of all sorts of unexplained phenomenon. They're transported to this island and there's a big bubble around it. And with Twilight being Twilight and the human being a kind of an engineer for the US Army, being very highly intelligent, as you can imagine, there's lots of philosophy in it, there's lots of science. They try to escape the island, they make up different kind of theories, different kind of plans, and again, as you can imagine, there's also a blood and romance there. But again, every time I think I get through one, I think of 5 others. I'm thinking of I believe it was just called Asylum, which is another fan fiction where Twilight Sparkle, somehow she wakes up in a sane asylum and all of her friends are either inmates or therapists there. She's told this horror story about how she suffers from psychopathy, how she killed a few ponies in a kind of outbreak, how she's been living in the facility for years, and she has this fake kind of world of Ponyville. And again, just really the mystery of that story becoming encapsulated in it, watching Twilight and very much living through her, if she kind of questions her own sanity, of whether maybe she is insane, maybe she's had these delusions, but then again, things not quite adding up, things seeming strange, wondering if somehow Discord's involved, how she got here, if she was transported into it. Again, just everything. Again, there's 1,000 more stories I can mention, both short stories, long stories, and if we're not solely focusing on kind of nostalgia older works, I can't remember the name of it, but very recently I finished which is actually not only the longest My Little Pony fan fiction I've read, not only the longest fan fiction or fiction book, but the longest book I have ever read, period. 1.3 million words. I literally just finished that just a few days ago, which was Praying Lamb, and I won't get into it because, again, 1.3 million words. I could sit here and talk about the plot for hours, but it's all the kind of... I mean, you could tell that I liked it if I sat through that long with it, but again, that I just finished that a few days ago. There was I'm really bad with names here on the kind of more recent ones, but there was the one of Rarity in Twilight in the Library. It's kind of an alternate universe fan fiction where Twilight's trapped in a library. She's kind of this... It's complicated regardless, but she's kind of this lost princess that's lived in the library for 1,000 years. Discord's cast some kind of perception spell on it, which means that people can't find it because they can't perceive it. Twilight comes across her, and again, as you can imagine with many of these stories, there's a romance there. There was the one I finished literally just about less than a year ago. Just less than a year ago, which was about 600,000 words, which involved kind of Twilight discovering what harmony was, discovering that... Again, I could go on and on about stories I read 10 years ago and stories I read literally last week. Again, I've not even talked about Lyra yet, at least not properly, but my main kind of point being, I've not talked about the gay stories either, being that, again, My Little Pony fan fiction, it's always been this consistency in my life. It's always been this little piece of nostalgia. It's always been this kind of refuge that I felt I can go to, that I can live vicariously through this. That, again, it's just... I really feel like it's the excellent way that the fan fiction site is set up in general. It is genuinely one of, if not the best engineered sites I've came across in terms of the algorithm. How easily you're able to find stories, the kind of manipulations you can put into the search engine. Yeah. I know I'm not saying much, I know I'm getting quite exasperated, I know I'm rambling, but I'm sure you can tell just in the tone of my voice how kind of passionate about it I am, and the kind of meaning that it's had in my life. Yeah. Actually, recording this video has made me quite wistful of it, and I think I'm going to find something. I'm not going to find something that's 1.3 million words long, I can tell you that, but I think I'm going to find something shorter. I'll put in the tags human, romance, slice of life, comedy when I got home, I'll put it up to high rating, and I'll see if I can find something. I may even put before 2015, so I can really get that feeling. I'm not going to look for a story that I've already read, but rather a new one that I very much would have read in that area, that again isn't like Praying Lamb or some of the kind of stories that I've been listening to recently, kind of dramatic, this big plot, but it's just very simple, very light-hearted, slice of life, romance. Again, something that is beautiful and simple and humble, but I don't really have to really think about in any kind of intense way, that it doesn't have some big mystery or plot or adventure, or again just something simple, something that, like the kind of stories that I had listened to and I had read before when I was in high school, when I was a teenager, going from 11 again right through in my teenage years. Something nice, simple, slice of life, a little bit of romance, a little bit of comedy, something sweet with a nice little world. But with that, I think I will finish off the video. The next one's probably going to be about how my sexuality relates to the fandom, kind of discovering gay fan fictions, and then I'm going to have to do one on the mayor herself, Lyra Heartstrings, the one, the only, everyone's favourite minty coloured unicorn, my waifu, my beloved, my little dreamboat, Lyra Heartstrings. She will get her own video, trust me, she will probably get 2. She deserves 20, so she should at least get 2. But again, I'm just going to finish off here and head back. Again, got quite a few more videos in this series, but I'm quite happy with this one. I feel like it was concise enough, but it's also portrayed the emotion that I have around the series, and well, again, not just the series but the fan fictions.